federal law, which does in fact allow you to discriminate against people with criminal convictions, but within a pretty narrow framework. You have to have an argument for why it's relevant to the job in question. Of course, that's a pretty easy argument to make in practice, but still, this was better than nothing. The thing that I learned was that, somewhat surprisingly, coming from a posture of suing the state, everybody was extremely well-intentioned. Everybody was on board. We had a great commissioner of the Department of Correction. We had a ton of people. It's like 10 times worse, but the same kind of thing, to be a politician, because you have the world's largest and craziest jury. And it's, you know, there is this way in which people who are completely well-intentioned find it completely impossible to pass the kind of legislation that they know will, in a really simple, cost-effective way, make everything much better. Like the fact that people who are in state custody in Connecticut with the DOC cannot get DMV ID while they are incarcerated based on the fact that they are in the custody of the state. The state knows who they are, theoretically, right? If they don't, you have a little bit of a problem, maybe. Nevertheless, this has been an impossible impediment for many years, and not because there aren't legislative sponsors for this, not because it doesn't make all the sense in the world, not because it would cost all that much more than the average of $45,000 a year that it takes to incarcerate people. You know, and then there's the question of litigation. So with reentry, you don't necessarily have much of a hook for litigation. If you've got, you know, we were talking earlier about there's a case, I gather, in Ohio that's a class action that's focused on the treatment. There you have the ADA, the Americans with Disabilities Act. But in general, it's not like people have an entitlement in Connecticut even to anything associated with parole, let alone, you know, health and well-being and education and food and all those kinds of things. So, you know, the one thing you can do, I mean, there are places like New York City where I think there has been successful litigation because you get into the policies posture, you know, push some legislation through, and then you sue them. So, I mean, that's one option, right? You can pass the ban the box, and then as people are sort of struggling to implement it, you know, you can litigate it. That's one approach. There's also the approach that McGregor, I think, will probably talk some about, and Alicia as well. You can be a public defender. And a lot of times that involves, you know, thinking about the ways in which you can prevent collateral consequences from attaching to people at the point of conviction. And I'll leave the people who know about that to talk about it. If you aren't fully able to prevent the collateral consequences, you're still part of a system that people are going to be going through, and making that system humane in some way and functional in some way is a contribution to this. What I do now is actually employment discrimination class actions for the most part. And that's another possibility, that kind of thing. There are, you know, Title VII does exist. It's not ideal in the sense that it does allow discrimination, but it doesn't allow the kind of blanket discrimination that actually takes place. And I think that there are, I haven't looked into this much, but there are some cases out there where I think they're now suing both Lowe's and Home Depot for just blanket exclusion of people with criminal convictions on the basis of nothing. Which is very easy to do if you've got the box on the application and you say, you know, I'm sorry, you know, you're such a wonderful candidate, but we just found someone even more wonderful. You know, best of luck.
Traditional public defender in a lot of ways. We have high volume. We accept every case that comes in that's assigned by the court, so we don't choose our clients. But we've tried to do things a little bit differently. So I run the civil practice there, and what we try to do is kind of marshal all of the resources of the office, so lawyers, social workers, investigators, paralegals, to provide holistic services to our clients and their families, kind of from the moment that we meet those, because now all of these people who are swept up have permanent criminal records, and this is a result of technology and a lot of complicated things going on. But at the end of the day, a lot of black and brown people are arrested all the time. And you know, we see this certainly in the city, and it's true nationwide. And you know, there in the city alone, in New York, there are thousands of people who are arrested for trespassing in their own public housing project. Either because of priors or whatever else, they plead guilty in arraignments, because otherwise they're going to be held in jail. And who's going to fight a trespass case that's a non-criminal offense in jail? But then they have yet another conviction. Just to kind of pull out the numbers a little bit, nationwide there are 14 million people who are arrested every year. That's from the FBI. And so that's a stark contrast to this kind of number that a lot of people talk about, the 650,000 who return from prisons every year, which is the significant time. When you drill down into it a little bit more, in New York City, there are a little over 100,000 admissions to New York City jails every year. So that's kind of like one churning cycle. But then you pull back a little bit more, and you realize that there are about 360,000 online arrests. So these are like permanent criminal records that are created every year in New York City alone. Pull back a little bit more, and there are 500,000 summonses that are written. Again, another permanent criminal record of a different type. About 60% of those warrant, and so go on to even the bigger national database. And then you pull back from that again, and about 600,000 people are stopped and frisked every year by the NYPD. This is just New York City. So, I mean, this is the kind of permanent marginalized class that's being created by the policing strategies. And this, I mean, it's not a trickle, it's a flow. This directly results in all of the problems with prisons and reentry from prisons, because this is the beginning, right? And this is what creates this problem. So you move on from kind of knowing the client population. And at every step of the game, you have to know kind of what the population is that you're talking about so you can structure your services to best serve their needs. So we have a different set of services that are needed for our client population, which is a lot broader than for the much narrower population coming out of prisons. The second big point is kind of the range of legal and practical disabilities that occur from the moment of arrest. So we know from the moment of arrest that people are in danger of losing their housing, their jobs, their right to live with their kids, and even the right to live in this country. And this is a perfectly predictable result of an arrest. Sometimes it's a legal result, like a barrier to living in public housing. And sometimes it's a practical result. Just to kind of expand on the fees, fines, and surcharges. So we do a lot of work with kind of those issues with our clients, but we also have this kind of whole unofficial set of work that we do with trying to get our clients' property back from the police. So our clients go, they get arrested and they have $50, $100 taken from the police, and where's their rent money if they're arrested in their apartment, so they've got like $1,500. And the police pretty much routinely refuse to get it back. So I have 2 paralegals, and about half of their job is hounding the NYPD to make them give back the money. And last year they got back almost $300,000 for our poor clients. I mean, it's insane. So this is the kind of like daily oppression that happens with clients who live in poverty as soon as they're swept into the criminal justice system. But this kind of stuff prevents them from kind of gaining any stability in their life, because they're already living on the margins, and when you inject the criminal justice system in, it's incredibly disruptive. Other kind of practical disabilities, you go into, you get arrested, you go to court, you're in for 24 hours, and you have a pending case, maybe your defender gets you out. But the case is very distracting, to say the least. So you kind of are just much more likely to ignore that letter from your landlord, or from public assistance that gives you a work assignment. Or maybe you have a conflicting court-mandated treatment appointment, and so you miss your work assignment, then your public assistance case gets cut off, then your rent stops getting paid, and you're evicted. So these are the types of things that we provide services around. So it's not only kind of discrimination based on criminal records, but it's also just all of these problems of people who live in poverty that are magnified by the criminal justice system. And then related to that is the continuum of care, so the pre and post jail concept, and we kind of pull it back further. So from our perspective, reentry is a process that begins from the moment of arrest, and for us, we just call it that because it's the first time that we see a client. And so we want to be able to provide as many services as possible and identify clients' needs and try to get them to engage if they choose to from the first time that we meet them, so that we can kind of deal with the domino effect that happens as soon as you get involved in the criminal justice system, and that affects kind of these tremendous numbers of people and families.
Use the Department of Correction in particular in trying to figure out first of all, who's going to be returning to New Haven, and how to make sure that we're able to do, for instance, the reach-in services, make sure that people are contacted before they come out. So, in terms of where they spend their last 6 months, right now, it's whatever facility they're in, anywhere in the state. And the point at which they return to New Haven is literally on the morning that they're released. They're taken to the facility on Lilly Avenue and released from there. So some of the work that I've done with the Department of Corrections is trying to figure out, and this goes back to the question of who's in the facilities and who's returning to New Haven and when are they returning to New Haven. So one of the things I've been working very closely with the Department of Corrections on is trying to get literally a list of who's coming back and when they're coming back, so that someone can meet them, or that, and also to set up a volunteer program where people who are interested in doing reach-in can start talking to people who are coming back to New Haven before they get dropped off on Lilly Avenue. I think one of the advantages of trying to build this relationship with the State Department of Corrections is that they have become more responsive to the idea that we need to start thinking about reentry before, and that reentry is something that the Department of Corrections should be thinking about. We've worked with the Department of Corrections on developing a grant application for Second Chance Act that would actually try and focus on people 6 months before they're reentering the community. But that's not in place right now. The Department of Corrections has actually developed an agreement with the DMV to put together people's applications for their driver's licenses. If their license was suspended and they already had it, then they can get their license back and be getting it when they're getting released. That's a pretty small number of people, and the number of people who can actually access that program and who then actually succeed in getting their ID is small, but it's one step. And I think the level of coordination, looking at the State Department of Corrections and then even the other state agencies, one of the things that I've encountered, for instance, with a client who I met with this week, who had he'd been released from incarceration a little over about 2 weeks ago. He had his Department of Corrections counselor, while he was incarcerated, had worked with him. He's disabled, and she had worked with him to try and make sure that his benefits, that he was applying to the Department of Social Services for his benefits, and that his application would be in there in process, so that when he got out, he would be getting SACA medical and food stamps. He gets out, he goes to the Department of Social Services on Bassett Street, and they say, "We don't have your application yet." So this guy's living in a shelter, has no identification, no benefits. I start working with him, and I'm calling the Department of Social Services, and they say, okay, we've got his SACA medical set up, so he has medical care. But his food stamps, his expedited food stamps, even though he already had an application in, apparently every caseworker there has about 1,600 cases, and it takes them 2 weeks to process the expedited application, and then it takes another week for them to make a decision. So this guy's expedited food stamps are going to take 3 weeks to get to him. So that's just a sort of very long answer about the kind of ways in which I think it's very challenging to try and make sure that all of the different state agencies are talking to one another, and they're talking to the city, and trying to, even with the services that are already available, making sure that people are actually able to access those services that are in theory there.
The last thing that I heard
about child support issues. I know McGregor knows quite a bit, and Alicia, you were speaking a bit about the whole cost issue, but that also creates a tremendous impediment to employment, right? And so we have to find ways to help individuals leaving prisons and jails deal with that and smooth out the payment schedule so it doesn't become a disincentive. What are the obligations? 98% of all convictions are obtained by pleas, certainly in New York City, certainly most jail commitments are the result of pleas. And what are the obligations of both the prosecutor and the defense attorney with respect to ensuring that the defendant is fully cognizant of the disabilities that might be incurred as the result of taking the plea?
The law in Connecticut, up until October of last year, was that even though your felony was nollied, it would not be erased from your record because you pled to the lesser charge. And people did not know that, and that is a huge issue. Someone thinks that they pled to a misdemeanor, and the misdemeanor is what's going to show up on their record, and they don't realize that this felony is still going to show up. Even though it says it's nollied, it's still a felony that shows up. A law was actually enacted in Connecticut, and I think this is sort of a positive example of legislation that went into effect in October, saying that any nollied felony, even if it's part of a multiple charge.
Incentives, and has to pay for each other's kind of problems as you move through the system. I mean, it's really complicated, but that's the only way you're going to get structural changes.
Beginning in the early 1970s, a substantial, indeed historically unprecedented, transformative increase in the scope and extent of incarceration has taken place. This is a historical event. This is a significant indicator of the outcome, or normative judgment one might apply, just as a matter of descriptive historical understanding of social developments. Something transformative has happened. In 2007, we have 1.5 million in prison, another 750,000 in jail, 800,000 on parole, and some 4.2 million on probation, bringing the total population under correctional supervision or detention to in excess of roughly 7.5 million persons in the United States in the population. If you look from 1980 to 2008, you get a significant increase, more than a tripling in the incidence of incarceration in the country. But if you look at the breakdown by race and by education, you can see the inequalities involved among white men who are young. The incarceration rate in 2008 is 1,750 per 100,000. But amongst white men without a high school diploma, it's 11,950 per 100,000, some 6 times higher. So poorly educated men are much more heavily represented. Among black men, you can see that the same is true. Poorly educated men are much more heavily represented, but you can also see that the scope of incarceration amongst black men is very much higher than comparable white men, such that for black high school dropouts who are young, by 2008, we're looking at, in fact, greater than 1/3 data on the cumulative lifetime risk. Will a person have been in prison by the time they reach the age 35? Again, the inequalities are quite striking. I've got 10 minutes left, so I'll just leave it at that. The inequalities are quite striking, and that big number on the right-hand blue column is 69% of black men who are high school dropouts by 2009 are estimated to have an experience of incarceration before reaching the age of 35. Time is limited, and I don't want to leave out my editorial. So I'm a social scientist. I observe a profound break with historical trend and a massive transformative increase in the scope of an institution, and when I ask what are the consequences of that, what are the implications of that? If for inequality, those implications are significant, because the inequality created by incarceration could be said to be both invisible, cumulative, and intergenerational. Invisible because it's a concentrated and segregated phenomenon, hidden from the mainstream of society. I mean, I'm surprised how often when I present data like this, not to an audience as informed as you, people are shocked, people are surprised, their eyebrows raised. We don't know what's going on behind the curtain, so to speak. Not as much a part of our political consciousness. And invisible also in the sense that social statistics often underestimate the extent of inequality in society by not counting people who are incarcerated as a part of the statistical pool in which various estimates of the social inequality or base doesn't survey people who are institutionalized, and therefore the incarcerated will be left out of that. Bruce Western has done one simple calculation to illustrate the effect of this invisibility. If you were to look at the employment rate amongst young, poorly educated black men, you can see there that in the period from 1990, half or less of them are employed. That's the official number using the current population survey data to estimate the employment rate. But if you augment those data by taking into account the part of that population who are incarcerated and re-estimate the employment rate, counting incarcerated persons as not employed, you see that the rate of employment amongst poorly educated black men is actually much lower than the official employment rate would suggest. That's the blue line there in the figure. Cumulative, because incarceration scars the people who are incarcerated. It reduces their economic viability post-incarceration. They have a harder time getting jobs and keeping them, and their earnings are lower. And various estimates of the effects of incarceration on the economic viability of incarcerated persons post-release produce numbers like 40% reduction in earnings from the effect of incarceration and 50% or more reduction in the employment rates for people post-release. I have to say, affect people once the incarcerated person gets outside of the prison. Norms of behavior that are necessary for survival in an institution, total institution like a prison, can become norms of behavior in the community once enough people have cycled in and out of the prison institutions and are coming back to be residents in the community. People who are in families where persons are incarcerated, having been deprived of the presence of the incarcerated person and having been burdened with the stigma of an incarcerated parent, have their own lives blighted by the incarceration of the parent. And so there is an intergenerational effect associated with incarceration. Just to give you some sense of the magnitudes involved, here are data on the number of children with incarcerated parents over a series of years from 1980 to 2008. What you can see there for Hispanics is that number rises from approximately 100,000 to some 500 plus, maybe 600,000 by the end of the series. Those are the number, these are absolute numbers, not rates, of children with incarcerated parents for whites, and that's the series for blacks. I mind you now, there are 5 or 6 whites for every black in the population. The number of blacks with incarcerated, children with incarcerated parents is vastly larger than whites or Hispanics. Okay, so that's a system that judges in a disparate way, so that if you're a high school dropout or if you're a black inner city male, you get convicted on a set of facts that you wouldn't get convicted on if you were white. You get sentenced to a longer sentence than you would have been sentenced to if you were white. That would be one way in which it would be an outrage. Let's call that straightforward racial discrimination. Okay. There's another way, and we could look into that, and people have looked into that, and to my knowledge, the bottom line on that kind of inquiry is, yeah, there's a little bit of that going on, but can't come close to explaining the racial disparity, which is largely accounted for by differences in offending rates between racial populations. This is an argument that you will find people making, not only conservatives. But there's another sense in which this is an outrage, because even if I give you the point, and I'm not quite yet prepared to concede it, that there's essentially a racially fair and unbiased procedural mechanism at work that has produced this outcome. That mechanism, even if I were to concede that point, and I'm not yet quite prepared to concede it, but just for the sake of argument, that mechanism operates within a context of economic, social, historical, cultural, and political facts, which are profoundly race-influenced. Okay? So that we have failures of basic institutions in the society. We have ordered our social relations in a way that reinforces and reproduces inequality. We locate the housing projects in a particular part of the city and we concentrate the poor people together. We underinvest in the development of the human capacities of a significant fraction of our population. We decide to launch a war on drugs and then give the enforcers of that war discretion to apply the awesome power of the state where and when they would choose to do so, and lo, they don't do it ecumenically. The drug users on Brown University's campus are not in danger of having their doors broken down or being caught up in a sting operation or whatever it is. And we get a vastly disproportionate incidence of the burden of law enforcement on the people who are weakest and poorest in our society. There's a collective responsibility as well as individual wrongdoers' responsibility at work in the processes that produce these social dysfunctions, which we then respond to with imprisonment. We're not just meting out justice on a case-by-case basis to individual wrongdoers here. We're engaged in the governance of our society, in the control of unruly populations, in the management of failed institutions that reach far outside of the policing and law-abidingness questions, and they reach into the questions of basic human development. And we're managing this failure, which is a social failure, which is a societal shortcoming, by freighting this weight of punishment onto individuals, some of whom are the weakest and least disadvantaged persons in our midst. When I say this, I'm making no excuse for the rapist, the burglar, the murderer, too thin a reed, way too insubstantial a basis on which to freight the legitimation of such a massive system of social control and deprivation of liberty. This is violence. This is coercion, institutionalized, legitimated, domestic, against a domestic enemy. And we ought to be ashamed of ourselves for having so constructed and not being critically reflective and sort of morally sensitive to the consequences of what we have wrought. What we have wrought. Some may say they are simply reaping what they have sown. I say, oh no. We here have produced an outcome, but we freighted the cost of the outcome that we have produced onto those who are at least able to manage it. If that sounded like an apologia, I can live with that.
I think it's essential that this be taken on simultaneously. The question is whether we have the will to do that. The state versus local sort of dichotomy here, at what level do these policies operate, is problematic. The proposition I'm putting to you is that a governor and other state officials say that this is part of their responsibility to reduce crime, gives them not just cover, but gives them a way to reduce prison populations. But only if they simultaneously tie this to a different way of thinking about the relationships between police, and particularly communities of color, and reassert the legitimacy of the rule of law. I'd be happy to talk to you about that some more, but he just said stop.
It's a primary period of time. There were a couple of places that had instituted determinate sentencing policies and so on, but I think a couple of places that had created sentencing commissions. But these developments really were only affecting prison populations at the margins. There really is that these are, in fact, a series of distinctive stories. What's happening down there is different than what's happening over there. And I think we need to take that into account. Now, social scientists really like normal distributions. And we took the distribution and tested it, and in fact, this is a normal distribution, which means for a stat head to the audience, you can run ordinary least squares regressions, and it's very simple, and everybody can interpret it. But what's really important is to think about who is on what tail. The big states, there are big states on this tail, which, for example, Pennsylvania and Illinois. Go back up. There are states in the middle, Texas, Ohio, a couple of other large states, and in the low end, New York, Florida, and still yet another couple of large states. So there is disaggregation by the states. It's not all about the high crime states. It's not all about the high prison population states. And what's interesting is that if you add up the small states down on this end, you get as much total growth as you do for all the big states. So there's something going on that was very much of a contagious process across the states. The moral of the story is not that we can understand or make perfect sense of this, it's that we need to think about state-level stories to incorporate the policy choices that are reflected in Glenn's talk, for example, the legislative dynamics, the political institutions, and the moves they made. I want to know, for example, why New York, which was a pretty nasty place, still experienced relatively low growth compared to the other places.
For some people to be removed from their midst and to be removed from the larger community as well. It is also true that we can predict that removing large numbers of demographically and geographically concentrated people impacts negatively a community's ability to engage in strategies, behaviors, norms that keep that community safe and also perpetuate norms of law-abidingness. That is, the very structure of communities and the interactions that people have allow them to adopt norms and habits that allow them to keep, not only to keep safe, but also to engage in positive projects. And those things, those habits, norms, are impacted by the approach to imprisonment that we have adopted in this country. That's point one. Point two. I think it's useful to bring up a point that's often emphasized in these kinds of discussions of imprisonment, but hasn't been emphasized here, and that is the issue of the length of sentences in this country. Many people think that sending lots of people to prison for a very long time has driven prison growth in this country. And it is true that the sentences in the United States are much longer than the sentences imposed for offending in other countries. It's also true that our data on time served is imperfect at best. But some measures suggest that the median sentence is about 2 years for most prisoners. And that's true in every state, whether you're talking about a punitive state like Michigan or a less punitive state like Minnesota. According to my former student and law professor, John Pfaff, he teaches at Fordham, what's driving our prison population appears to be admissions. We send people to prison, typically for relatively short periods of time, for not very serious stuff. And what this means is that to do something about the prison population size, we need to cut admissions rather than sentence that are in political legitimacy. But both stand in contrast to an instrumental deterrence-based notion that's at the base of our appetite for prison, I think, and that justify its existence of hanging over people's head the big stick. But it turns out that most people, whether they're criminally involved or not, obey the law most of the time. And they say that they do so for the exact same reasons. That is, the regular and serious offender, even the serious offender, obeys the law most of the time, and he obeys the law for the same reasons that most of you sitting in this room obey the law. So, if the criminal justice system wants to take this idea seriously, as I think it should, then there are all sorts of ways of reimagining what we do. It's hard to necessarily reimagine doing prison differently because, of course, the existence of the way we do prison is based on a different way of thinking about compliance. There are other aspects of the criminal justice system that can take this idea seriously. I think there are places where folks are doing it and have begun this project. Most obviously with policing, and Jeremy has mentioned that briefly in his talk. And if we do it, we will get higher levels of compliance, fewer prison admissions. That should lead to a lowering of the size of the prison population, and hopefully we'll end up with a fairer criminal justice system. And I came in with 1 minute left.
I read it and understood better, but as I pointed out, have to remind people that we have seen significant increases in the prison populations in states that have offset those decreases. So we want to figure out what they've done, and we haven't talked much about the growth of the federal system. The Federal Bureau of Prisons has doubled in the past 10 years. Remarkable, right? And there's a government that has no fiscal constraint. Right? So if we thought the recession was going to slow down state prison growth, it's certainly not slowing down federal prison growth. I want to make one slight, take a slight issue with something that Tracy said. I think it's worth focusing on long-term prisoners. So this didn't get to the elaborating this idea of mine that if this hypothetical governor were to take this on seriously and set up a sort of commission to look at sentencing issues, first of all, I have a lot of business people on that commission because you get a lousy return on investment. But one of the things you find pretty quickly, depending on the state, is that there are a lot of people in prison for the rest of their lives. And we had the statistic yesterday, 10% of people in prison are there for life sentences. We have geriatric prisons where people are on dialysis machines, not being released. So I think, and this is, as we know, so looking chronologically, this is the time of lowest risk of reoffending. So I think if you're thinking about a 20-year plan to reduce by half the prison population, you would start now. We're not going to sentence people so that they die in prison when they're 70. So you have a low-risk population that's releasable, and if you start thinking now about changing your sentencing structure, you can save a lot of money. And it's not to say that I would also do what Tracy wants to do, but I think there's a benefit to focusing on long-term.
I-
What's behind the backlash? I mean, we all know, just from first principles, that there is no perfectly safe world, right? We know that we pay a price in lives on the highway by allowing speed limits to be 70 miles an hour and not 40 miles an hour, and we live with that. We know that airplanes sometimes crash, no matter how much safety precautions we might take, and yet we enjoy the benefits of aviation at home. What I'm trying to get at here is the question of the infinite value that's placed on public safety, right? The idea that if you make a change in the system and it has any evidence of a diminution of public safety, then that gets a salience that's all out of proportion to the significance that it should have in weighing what a policy decision would be. The idea that if Mike Huckabee commutes somebody's sentence and they then go and commit a horrific crime, that proves that the whole idea of commutation of sentences is a bad thing, and the fellow who made the particular commuting decision is a bad fellow who ought to be elected to the office. Where does this outsized value placed on public safety relative to the lives of millions of our fellow citizens come from? Might it not come from the fact that we value the humanity of these fellow citizens in our de facto public decision making rather less than we should? And shouldn't the fundamental argument be a human rights argument? An argument not about the micro policy management of this particular area of policing and incarceration, but rather a political argument about our unwillingness de facto to extend a presumption of equal humanity to all of our citizens, such that some of our citizens can literally be treated like chattel. We can herd them, we can corral them, we can prod them, and we can do just about anything with them, and it barely raises a blimmer. Let me put it this way. It will sound trite, but I mean it really quite seriously. If my students at Brown University were being dragged out of their dorm rooms for smoking marijuana or taking tabs of ecstasy or snorting heroin at anything like the rate that they actually do it, okay? The people who give millions of dollars a year to Brown University, I'm talking about the parents of my students, would be all over the courts and the legislatures of this country demanding that we confront the inhumane institutions that we have built around us. But instead, it's only the residents of public housing projects in Bedford-Stuyvesant and like places who are being dragged off in the hundreds of thousands. And as a result, we're prepared to countenance this institutional development in effect because we don't value the humanity of the people who are the subject to it. Now, if I'm wrong about that, please somebody give me the refutation.
We should raise your moving variance. They are going up at a very high rate, almost sort of like in the 80s. So there's a phenomenon about both this sort of twin effect of social change and anxiety, and then using the power of the state to incarcerate as a way to sort of quell that anxiety.
So, the observation I want to make can be made very quickly. I mean, think about what was just said, if true, if correct. Think about, let's get beneath the surface, right? On the surface, differentially people within the society who have the capacity to mobilize state resources of coercion on behalf of subjective, oh, I sense insecurity and want more punishment in my midst. I mean, think about that. We are a democracy, but we're a constitutional democracy. What about the equal protection of the laws in a world in which different factions have the capacity to get the police on their side in what are really arguments over whose town is this in the first place? I mean, am I off base here or what?
Countries that are engaged in early releases in order to, programs of early release in order to bring prison populations down. Most extreme, of course, is California, which is so extreme it's just hard to think of it as holding many lessons for the rest of the country. And their prison population will come down considerably. So the point I want to make was a fairly straightforward one, which is that there's a risk, and I think that risk is being realized in a number of states, and highlighted at the time this morning, that those policies will be subjected to some sort of public backlash for a variety of reasons. And I think that's the political reality. What I would hope would happen is that some elected official or corrections official in this environment would say, we're doing some things right now that are going to create some risk, and not present this as being risk-free, it's public safety risk. And we're doing it because we have to save money. But this is not the way to govern. This is not the way we should make these decisions. And in fact, says this, my hypothetical official, we have extended the reach of incarceration and other forms of punishment over the last 30 years in ways that are not healthy for our society. It costs us too much. It allows the power of the state to be exercised in unhealthy, unproductive ways. It's causing the intergenerational effects that you alluded to, Glenn, that we've talked about over this conference. And therefore, I want my state, says this governor, to be in a very different posture 20 years from now, because this is unhealthy. So I think it's possible to have both of those narratives going on at the same time in the political discourse. And what I would suggest is an essential part of that is not only this won't raise crime rates, but that we also have to have a different approach to public safety and reference the work that a number of us have been doing that does try to get at particularly some immigration divides around the way we approach police.
This is a good way to challenge these strikes because we have no choice.
I'm Danny Parker and I'm a judge. I have a question for Professor Lowry, and I want to preface it by saying how much I enjoyed your remarks and what you had to say. There's a book that came out several years ago called Gang Leader for a Day. I don't know whether I'm familiar. It's an extraordinary it's an extraordinary book, and it's about, for those of you in the audience who haven't read it, it's about the experience of a sociologist, who studied basically crack gang Robert Taylor projects in Chicago, and it's really an extraordinary work. I think so. And so, Professor Lowry, I have this question for you. Let's say that the tenants organization and Robert Taylor, and you can substitute Robert Taylor for E.C. Lewis or Benning Road in Washington, wherever, had a meeting, and the complaints are ones that you can imagine. Our lives are we are terrorized by these kids for selling drugs who've taken over the project. We can't get any help from the police. Prostitutes in the stairwells, urine in the stairwells. I'm a single. And you're the expert in that meeting, and they ask, we need respite